So this is where we're headed in this week's learning opportunity, in this week's module. We're going to take our Vue instance to the next level. In other words, we've created a single instance of a Vue application. Was a Vue object that we are creating from our Vue class, and it's a single instance. But now we want to start thinking about what we're going to call components. And the idea behind components is if we look at each of these individual pieces, they're actually bootstrap components. And the idea is that they are repeatable pieces of code. And if we could just be able to stamp out the word card and have it replicate all of these cards with the individual differences, which is what an object is all about, right? It would make our code much cleaner. And if that doesn't make sense, well, hopefully it will by the time we're done with this week's module. What we're going to be doing then is this will be our end product, and the idea is we have three. These are actually bootstrap cards, and if I click on a button, for example, it's going to change the image. So that's where we're headed overall. Before I get started, I want to share this Vue add-on with you. If you do a search for a Vue browser extension, and they're available in either Chrome or Firefox, you'll end up here in a GitHub repository. And if you scroll down, there will be an option to either get the Chrome extension or the Firefox extension, whichever is your flavor. And the nice thing about this is that it will give you the ability to see your Vue instance. In other words, I have my inspector, my console, and then by clicking on this double chevron, let me go back here so you can see it. So if I click on the double chevron, it says, hey, there's that Vue. So that extension, that browser extension, installs Vue into your developer tools so that you'll be able to see more information about your Vue instance. So in this case, I have a very simple Vue instance. I have the root. We're going to call this the root because it's a single instance. And it's has a data. The data properties are simply I have a message, and that's where I sort of wired this up from. So I'll be using this from time to time as a visual, and I suggest that you get that downloaded as well, so or add it on to your browser. Anyway, so let's just get started. I have a HTML page created, and don't forget to link to your Vue CDN. I have my Vue template that has an ID of app. I have the curly mustaches that is hooking up to this message here, so I have some data binding going on just so I know that I've wired it up properly. I have an external style sheet called app.js in which my initial Vue instance is being created, and my hello Vue is in fact displaying here, so I know that I've wired everything up properly, and this is where we're going to go from here. The easiest way to understand components is probably just to jump in and watch them in action. So the first thing I need to do is I'm going to create a heading type component, meaning that I'm going to utilize the word Vue.component, and then component takes two arguments. The first one is what am I going to call this component, and I'm going to call this component headings, which is a user-defined word. It can be anything you want it to be, and you'll see how that works in just a moment. And then the second argument is going to be an object. And the first part of that object should always be a property called template. And in this template, no difference than we were creating a template here for our Vue instance. Remember when we did our original Vue instance? Now we're going to create a template for our component. We're going to create it a little bit different than we did before, meaning that I'm just going to use backticks for now. So the backtick, I'm going to create an H4. This is a heading, and I'm going to close that H4, and just like I would in HTML. And what I want you to first of all be aware of is that I intentionally put this Vue component description or definition above the Vue instance. This will not work if you have this component down here. This won't work. So I'm going to have it purposely above my Vue instance. The Vue instance will always be at the very bottom, and all of our components will be defined above it. And what will happen now if I refresh this page is nothing, because I didn't do anything with that component. So I'm going to erase this starter that I put on just to make sure that everything was working. And I'm going to put in an open and close headings tag. And remember that this is the word that I used here to define, to name this component. So this component is headings, and so any any descriptions or anything that I use to define what a headings component looks like, all I have to do is put in this headings open and enclosed headings tag. And then when I refresh it, whatever I use to define that component now shows up here as my HTML page. And in fact, it's being written as an HTML page. So in essence, and this doesn't make sense here, but we'll build on this, if I make two headings, then I'm going to have two components of headings that are going to type out exactly the way I described it. Now I do also want to bring to your attention that you have to have just a single element defined in a template. In other words, if I did something like this, I'm going to make some line breaks, and that's why I'm using backticks, because backticks will allow me to make multiple lines like this. If I, of course I lost my closing H4, or I didn't have it in the first place, I'm not sure which. All right, so if I have two elements defined here, so I have two elements defined as a H4 tag. So basically that's returning two elements. I'm going to get an error. And let's see, in my console, I should be getting an error. Yep. And so the error is saying component template, my component, should contain exactly one root element. Meaning that, see how there's two root elements here? If I wanted to do this, then I would have to do it, I have to return just a single root element. So let me kind of demonstrate what would have worked there. So now I have a single root element that could be nested with many elements, but the point is that the template itself contains a single root element that can have multiple elements within it. So if I do this, now I shouldn't get an error and everything is moving along just fine. So single root element is part of the template, and then you can return as many elements within that as you want. So that's the caveat right now to the template. So utilizing a template, a component, we're going to create a template, and in that template we can create components that we can use over and over again in our HTML. And the idea behind this is it's going to clean up our HTML quite a bit. So instead of having all these H4 tags or all of this HTML code, we simply have this word headings. And so we're doing what's called separation of concerns, which is a key component of programming. And the idea behind that word is we're cleaning up our code basically. So any of our headings information is being contained in this component definition. And if you look at the HTML, obviously it's much cleaner, but it should semantically also have more meaning. If, for example, we were doing a to-do list, we might call it to-dos or something along those lines. But we'll see more and more of this as we move along. But I just want you to get this overall concept that we're creating a component that is also reusable code that we can utilizing Vue and components we can tap into. So if I wanted to change this to headings, then wherever I had that component defined in my HTML is obviously going to take that change, so it's also easier to maintain and our code looks cleaner. So that is the start of creating new components.